The role of Hadith in Ikhtilāf among Muslim Jurists. Chapter 4. Conflict in a Hadith and the rules of preponderance. 1. At-Ta'arud, conflict. Different scholars have defined Ta'arud differently. Al-Asnawi defined it as the encounter of two evidences in a manner that each prevents the implication or practice of the other. There is a wide disagreement amongst the ulama in the possibility of existing conflict between legal evidences. The reason for this disagreement lies in the fact that the lawgiver is one, that is, God, and he is the wise. How could a conflict then possibly exist in the texts and evidences emanating from him? The majority of the scholars, including the four Imams, maintained that there is no actual conflict in legal evidence. The existing conflict is only in the perception of the mujtahid, meaning the one who performs ijtihad, the jurist, and his own interpretation and reasoning, not in the Shari'iyah itself. In this regard, Shafi'i says, no two sahih hadith may be totally irreconcilable unless one abrogates the other or qualifies it in one form or another. Ibn Khuzaymah says, I do not know of any conflicting ahadith narrated with sound isnads. Whosoever knows of such ahadith, let him inform me so that I may harmonize between them. A second group maintain that conflicts may exist in legal evidence themselves. As-Subki and Asifi al-Hindi, both Shafi'i scholars, are known to have held this view. Shawkani reports from al-Mawardi also that he believed the same. The third group of scholars differentiate between presumptive, dhanni, and definitive, qat'i evidences. This is the view of Baydawi, Ash-Shirazi, both Shafi'i scholars, and Al-Qadi, who himself is a Hanbali scholar. However, I maintain that the opinions of the first group, the majority, the second group of scholars, are easily reconcilable. This is so because the two groups, I contend, disagree on the concept of conflict when it is used in completely different contents. The second group understands from conflict that it occurs among scholars because of the different ordinances deduced from the same evidences, due to the different interpretations of those evidences. The former group, on the other hand, is referring to the fact that the two evidences cannot be inherently irreconcilable and mutually exclusive, but they do not dispute that the ordinances can be deduced from a single evidence because of the different interpretations of that evidence. This group maintains that the existence of such an irreconcilability would contradict with the concept of the perfection of the source of all Islamic legislations, that is, God. Thus they maintain that whenever two evidences appear to be conflicting and irreconcilable, there will definitely be another evidence which will outweigh one over the other, either through inciting abrogation or through a method of preponderance which will be dealt with in the following pages. Conditions necessary for the existing conflict. Ta'arud. One mujtahid may find a certain report conflicting with another. Others may view the same matter differently and get to an opposite conclusion. Hence, there are some conditions that may be fulfilled in order to say that conflict exists. These conditions, however, are not agreed upon unanimously by all scholars. We will mention some of these conditions with particular reference to the different views maintained with respect to them. 1. The validity of both conflicting evidences. Both conflicting evidences must have a legal evidence. If, for example, a mawdu hadith conflicts with an authentic hadith, then we cannot assume that we have a situation of conflict, because the spurious hadith is not a valid source of legal evidence. Hence, the other authentic hadith remains absolutely valid and safe from any conflict. 2. The impossibility of harmonization between the two sides. There must not be any chance of possibility. There must not be any chance or possibility of harmonizing the two conflicting sides. This is the opinion of a group of Usuli scholars like Ibn Hajib and Al-Adud. The majority of scholars, however, disagree with them. They hold the view that whatever appears to be a conflict is enough, even though it may be possible to harmonize between them, since not every scholar is able to bring them to such harmony. 3. Conflict must be presumptive, dhanni, matters, and not in qat'i, definitive ones. The majority of Shafi'i scholars maintain that ta'arud does not exist between the definitive evidences. However, some Hanafi scholars, such as Ibn Hammam and others, disagree, rightly in my opinion, with them. What supports the Hanafi view is that the fact that the conflict actually exists with respect to the implication of the legal text or evidence, not its validity. A definitive valid evidence may be both a presumptive inclination, dhanni al-adilla, or a definitive one, qat'i al-adilla. If it was a presumptive implication, nothing will prevent it from conflicting with another hadith, which is also dhanni ad-dilala. Indeed, it is possible to have a qat'i evidence conflicting with a dhanni one, especially if it is realized through ta'arud. Actually, there only exists the perception of the mujtahid. An example of this would be the conflict existing between some verses of the Quran and several ahadith. The scholars have compared between the two, even though the Quran is qat'i al-thubut by consensus. These points support the Hanafi view mentioned above. 4. Equality between two conflicting evidences. This equality exists with respect to a. Equality in the validity or authenticity of the evidences, b. Equality in the implication, sense, meaning of the evidences, c. Equality in the quantity. It was mentioned above that it is not necessary for conflict that both evidences be equal in validity. Indeed, a qat'i al-thabut may conflict with a dhanni al-thabut, since what is important is the sense and meaning of the evidence, not its thabut. As for the equality in quantity, it is not regarded necessary by the Hanafis. One hadith may be in conflict with 100 hadith. What appears from the writings of the Jumhur, the majority, however, seems to disregard the equality issues totally. For them, a weak evidence may fall into conflict with a strong one. For example, there are many ahadith that conflict with Quranic verses, and the ulama have harmonized among them or preponderated one over another. 5. The unity in the advent of both conflicting evidences in time and place. If the time or place of the two evidences are different, there is no conflict. For example, 1. Buying and selling is generally allowed. However, it is not allowed during the time of Friday prayers. There is no conflict here because the two situations differ in place. 2. Having intercourse with one's wife is generally permitted. However, it is not allowed during the monthly menstruation period. There is no conflict here because the timing is different in each case. If a mujtahid is faced with two conflicting evidences, what are the procedures which should be followed? What can he do? What is the attitude of jurists and scholars when two such conflicting evidences exist? It is preferred to harmonize jam' between the two conflicting evidences, or to preponderate tarjih between them, or we just assume that one of them abrogates the other. In order for us to answer these questions, it will be helpful to examine the opinions of the usulis and the fuqaha in this matter. This will enable us to ascertain the methods followed when two hadiths are in conflict. The study of some recent research on this subject by contemporary scholars will throw light upon our path. I will first mention their views. Following them, I will give my comments. The first book which I examine is called At-Ta'arud wa Tarjih by Barzanchi. He mentions 3 procedures in dealing with the conflicting evidences. The first procedure of Al-Barzanchi attributes to the majority of scholars and usulis, including the 4 schools. It is a. To harmonize between two conflicting evidences. This is an effort to recognize both evidences as valid and not to cancel any of them. B. If jam is not possible, then we resort to preponderance at tarjih, which actually is to prefer one of the evidences and not act according to it. Of course, this is only done through certain means and methods, which will be mentioned below. C. If these 2 possibilities could be adhered to, then we should turn to abrogation. One of them is abrogated, and the other is the abrogator. D. If none of the above 3 procedures were possible, the 2 evidences are considered both cancelled and invalid. The second procedure, Al-Barzanchi attributes to the Hanafis, is to give the first priority to Naskh, but only when the preceding evidence is known. If the timing or date of the event is unknown, one of the evidences is supposed to be preponderant over the other. If the 2 evidences are both equal and none of them should be preferred over the other, then harmonization is resorted to. If harmonization is also not possible, then they both lose their validity and cancel each other. The third procedure is attributed by Al-Barzanchi to the majority of the muhaddithun. Their method is to give priority to jam', harmonization. If it was not possible, then they adhere to naskh. That is, if the preceding evidence is known. If the date is unknown, then tarjih is sought. Those who maintain this procedure do not believe in tasaqut, because in their view there is no example to prove that tasaqut is ever necessary. There is no such situation where any of these three methods, namely Jam', Naskh and Tarjih, cannot be used. This is what Al-Barzanji has suggested. However, he refers these procedures to footnotes in his book, and he does not mention the third procedure. That is the procedure he attributes to the Muhaddithin. Instead, he adds three more procedures. These are Naskh, Jam', Tarjih, attributed to some Hanafis and some of the Ahl Hadith. Tasaqut, which is cancellation, attributes to some of the Zahiris. C. Whenever there exists a ta'arud, then any of the two evidences could be used and the others cancelled, i.e. the mujtahid can choose the one that suits his purpose. This is briefly what Al-Barzanji mentions about the procedures followed by the ulama when two hadith are in conflict. Certain points have to be clarified and commented upon. A. He attributes the first procedure to the scholars of the four schools. The fact is that it is not the opinion of Shafi'i, hence attributing this view to the four schools without giving details is certainly a mistake. Al-Barzanji attributes the third procedure to the majority of the Muhaddithun, which is totally accurate. However, there are others who hold the same view and must be mentioned along with them, among them Shafi'i, Ghazali, Ibn Qudama and others. Shafi'i clearly stated this his view in his Ikhtilāf al-Hadith. Al-Ghazali's opinion is also clear on the subject in his book Al-Mustasfa. Al-Barzanji, strangely enough, did not mention the third procedure, that is the procedure of the Muhaddithun, when he discussed the subject in the footnote. However, he stated that the first procedure is the view of the Usulis and the Muhaddithin. Contrary to this, as mentioned above, the Muhaddithin have a different procedure. It is very difficult to understand why Al-Barzanji distinguishes between the two procedures in the text of his book and regards them as identical in his footnote. D. He attributes the fourth procedure to some Hanafis, but does not mention who these Hanafis are. It seems that he intends At-Taftazani, who maintains this in his book. The second book which I like to examine is Dr. Badran's Adillat al-Tashri' al-Muta'arida. He mentions three procedures only. A. Naskh, Tarjih and Jam'. He attributes this to the Hanafi scholars. B. Jam', Naskh and Tasaqut, cancellation. This he attributes to the Ghazali and Abdul Aziz al-Bukhari, a Hanafi scholar. C. Jam' and Tarjih, which he attributes to Asnawi, a Shafi'i scholar. Out of these three, Dr. Badran prefers to choose the first, Naskh, Tarjih and Jam'. However, some reservations must be held with regard to this assessment. He did not mention the view of the Jumhur at all. He did not even bother to note that a certain procedure was accurate in a case, unless he is referring to them by his reference to Al-Asnawi, which is very unlikely to be the case. Furthermore, he did not mention the procedure of the Muhaddithun, although it is very well established in their works. His reference to Ghazali's preference of Jam', Naskh and Tasaqut procedure is a certain mistake. Ghazali's view is clearly stated in his famous work Al-Mustasfa, wherein he states, if we are unable to harmonize between the two conflicting evidences, or we know the proceeding from the latter, then we resort to Tarjih and we choose the stronger evidence. It is clear from the above that this procedure is Jam', Naskh and Tarjih, contrary to what Dr. Badran wants us to believe. Dr. Badran's preference to the first procedure, i.e. Naskh, Tarjih, Jam', is questionable. How could a sound and legal evidence be cancelled when there is a possibility of Jam'? Instead, Nawawi's statement, how could one resort to abrogation when there is a possibility of Jam', is very accurate. Stay tuned.